Hi, this is TheHande, and let's talk about video game mascot characters. Now, as you are aware, big video game companies like having mascot characters like Mario or Sonic, for instance. And you might be aware that especially in the mid to late 90s, the video game industry actually went through a bit of a mascot craze during which almost every company tried to create their own iconic character that they could use as the face of the company. But in the famous words of Harlan Ellison, 90% of everything is crap, which unfortunately does apply also to the mascot craze, which really started to die down by the late 90s. And one of the big reasons why the mascot craze didn't end up creating that many iconic mascots in the long run is obviously because of this sort of artificial nature of the mascot craze, meaning that when companies try to intentionally create a character that would appeal to the youths in an effort to sell more video games, they were kind of acting on the false premise that a mascot was just something that you could will into existence rather than be created naturally. Because technically, I would say the late 1980s had its own less known mascot craze, but the difference between it and the post-Sonic mascot craze is the fact that most of these mascots were created organically through their games being incredibly popular, such as in the case of Mega Man for Capcom or Bob and Bob from Taito's Bubble Bobble. And today I wanted to talk about three interesting examples of failed mascots from various companies, which are Alex Kidd, Bonk the Caveman, and Bubsy the Bobcat. And let's start with Alex Kidd, which is appropriate enough, of course, because those of you who are even vaguely aware of forgotten mascot characters will probably know Alex Kidd as the original mascot for Sega before Sonic the Hedgehog came around. Alex Kidd debuted in 1986. His games were primarily released for the Sega Master System, with one exception being Alex Kidd and the Enchanted Castle for the Sega Mega Drive. And despite Sega putting him in various different sorts of games, the character in the long run just never managed to penetrate public consciousness in the same way as their main competitor Nintendo's Mario did, which is why when Sonic the Hedgehog hit the scene in 1991, Alex Kidd was pretty much dropped from the roster and ended up in the long list of beloved game IPs that Sega owns but never does anything with, except for releasing retro game collections every once in a while. Now, I have an old video where I reviewed all of the Alex Kidd games, and I have to be honest, I kind of regret the tone of that video because it seems like I was being really harsh on the games, because Alex Kidd in Miracle World and Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle are in fact pretty decent games, and I personally happen to enjoy them. But I think it's very obvious from the offset why Alex Kidd was never poised for such huge popularity, and that's because Alex Kidd was very transparently created as a direct competitor to Mario. If you compare the Japanese box art for his debut game, Alex Kidd in Miracle World, with the Japanese box art for Super Mario Bros., you will notice that it's a pretty blatant ripoff. But more so than that, I think another problem was the fact that Sega really lost its sense of direction with Alex Kidd very early on. With the only exceptions being Miracle World and Enchanted Castle, the rest of the Alex Kidd games just weren't very good. And on top of that, most of them weren't even platformers, which was, the genre that Mario had popularized around that time. Which I think is at least partly the reason why Alex Kidd kind of failed to create his own identity. On top of which, I think it's pretty obvious that Alex is a pretty generic-looking character. I mean, his most distinct traits are his comically large ears. And if I was to ask you who Alex Kidd's main nemesis in the games is, I think most of you would not be able to answer that, because Alex Kidd really didn't even have one. The bad guy from the first game, King Janken, didn't even appear in any of the Alex Kidd sequels. However, Sega has never fully abandoned Alex Kidd, despite the fact that he hasn't really appeared in his own games, with Sega often hiding Alex in various cameos in the backgrounds of other games. And because of this, over time, Alex has kind of developed this cult following and is now kind of the poster boy for forgotten video game mascots in his own right. Which brings us to Bonk the Caveman, which is interesting because Bonk was the mascot of a console but not technically owned by the company which made it. Those of you who know Bonk the Caveman know that, of course, his games appeared originally on the TurboGrafx 16, the often forgotten third-place runner in the 16-bit console war. Bonk began his life, however, originally as a comic character in NEC's newsletter as the character PC Caveman. The character inevitably ended up becoming so popular that NEC thought it would be a good idea to utilize the character's appeal in the form of a game, and so hired Hudson to create Bonk based on PC Caveman. Which is interesting because Hudson, of course, would go on to create their own iconic mascot character, Bomberman. But yes, Hudson were really NEC's closest ally during the time when they launched the original PC Engine console in Japan. But most of you are probably not necessarily aware of Bonk as the mascot of said console, or rather its Western version, the TurboGrafx 16, because for some bizarre reason, NEC's American division thought it would be a good idea to not use Bonk as the system's mascot, but rather create their own monstrosity in the form of Johnny Turbo. This is a character who appeared in TurboGrafx's advertising, bad-mouthing both Nintendo and Sega, particularly going hard on Sega and attacking their newly released Genesis system, calling it a cheap knockoff of the TurboGrafx. Which was ironic because this very marketing scheme was obviously based on Sega's own obnoxious and horrible Genesis Does campaign, and which ironically made the TurboGrafx 16 seem like the cheap knockoff by comparison. I've long held the hypothesis that one of the key features for the TurboGrafx 16's failure was NEC's absolutely abysmal marketing, which only focused on the console and completely ignored the games, which were by and large, really good. And I think it's also kind of obvious that NEC's American division, for whatever reason, didn't think having a cute mascot like Bonk was a good idea. And even though we're looking at this with 2020 hindsight, if you compare these characters, I think it's pretty obvious which one would be a more appropriate mascot for a children's video game console. Bonk had a grand total of 3 games on the TurboGrafx, but as I mentioned, the character was technically owned by Hudson Soft, so when the TurboGrafx eventually ran its course and became pulled from the market, Hudson Soft actually did try to move Bonk to other systems, specifically the Super Nintendo in the form of Super Bonk, at which point it became kind of painfully obvious that Bonk would never be able to penetrate popular consciousness the same way as some other mascots could. And don't get me wrong, I think Bonk is a pretty generic character anyway, but I still think he would have been a much more fitting mascot for his respective system if NEC had had the common sense to just use him properly. And then finally, from a console mascot that wasn't owned by the console developer, we come to a mascot who tried to get picked up for a console but never succeeded because nobody wanted him. And that, of course, is Bubsy the Bobcat. Bubsy the Bobcat was the creation of video game company Accolade, which to their credit by the mid-90s had become a fairly large company on the scene, and who in a rather bizarre move decided that they wanted to create their own mascot character, but not just to sell their own games. Accolade's scheme was apparently to make a mascot character so popular that he would usurp the popularity of Mario and Sonic and potentially get picked up as a mascot character for a console developer either by Nintendo, Sega, or one of their competitors. And again, hindsight being 2020, I think it is pretty obvious why Bubsy never took off. Not for a lack of trying though. Accolade actually produced a whole bunch of Bubsy games for all the various 16-bit systems, and obscure video game mascot fans might also be aware that Bubsy even got his own animated TV pilot, but though never a full series, which showed that Accolade had some pretty substantial plans for Bubsy to take the video game scene by storm. But again, if you look at Bubsy and compare him to all the other mascot characters that were created in the wake of Sonic the Hedgehog, he seems to just show all of the signs of an artificially created mascot character, which again, in my view, just shows why he was destined to fail. I mean, he's an attitude-filled anthropomorphic animal character in lieu of Sonic, wearing a very recognizable symbol, an exclamation point in lieu of Mario and the letter M on his cap. Now, Accolade's campaign to make Bubsy into a popular character finally ran aground in the mid-90s with the end of the 16 console-bit generation and the start of the 32-bit console generation, when the company made one last-ditch effort to make Bubsy popular by giving him his own 3D game, which of course became the now infamous Bubsy 3D. And for those of you unaware, Bubsy 3D, of course, shares the honor of being considered one of the worst video games ever made, a very early and extremely primitive example of a 3D platformer, which was nevertheless completely outclassed by its contemporaries like Crash Bandicoot, Croc, and of course the eventual Super Mario 64, which officially buried Bubsy into the ground, and these days he's mostly remembered as this very obnoxious and kind of an almost a caricaturish example of why the 90s mascot craze was such a terrible idea. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. I'm TheHande. See you on the next one.